introduce Dr. Poe as well, and then I'll just I will this will be just for the record. We will have it all on recording. Dr. Poe is a full professor of Pan-Africana Studies at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the alma mater of Nigeria's Nnamdi Azikiwe, Namibia's first female prime minister, Sahara Kugugangelwa Amandila, and Africa's Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. As a scholarist and professor, Dr. Poe organizes Afrocentric learning teams to evaluate Pan African experiences, initiatives, traditions, and innovations. He also serves as the director of the Horace Mann Bond Honors Program at Lincoln University. He is looking to discover qualified, competently Afrocentric junior faculty members to prepare the next generation of Azikaways, Kuungongelwa, Amadilas, and Nkrumahs. Uh, well, I mean, you don't have to look too far from Temple. I mean, we certainly will have those people. The time is soon for places like Lincoln University and elsewhere. Here's where tradition calls for innovation and cultural regeneration. Professor Poe is the regular board member and organizer with the Kwame Nkrumah Biennial International Conference. He is a senior fellow with Molefi Kete Asante Institute and a former board member of the Jopian Institute of Scholarly Advancement. He is an Nkrumahist, a social scientist, an Afrocentric historian by training. He has a PhD and an MA from Temple, and he also holds a BA in African American Studies and an MA in Social Sciences, interdisciplinary, both from San Jose State University. His master's thesis was titled "The Under Preparation of Predominantly White Colleges and Universities to Admit Black Students." Professor Poe's Temple University doctorate dissertation um, pro- um, focused on the Lincoln University alumnus Kwame Nkrumah and his specific contribution to the development of Pan Africanism. This dissertation was later reworked into a book with a similar title published by Routledge in 2003 and by the University of St. Croix Press in 2009. He has authored 9 chapters in scholarly books, 26 encyclopedia entries, and 10 articles in scholarly journals. Professor Poe currently sits on the board of 2 scholarly journals and has served as an on-screen consultant for the History Channel's The Spanish American War First Intervention. Besides holding a research and publishing focus on Kwame Nkrumah, Professor Poe has led a number of tours through Egypt and exposed tour participants to the Africanity of ancient Egyptian culture. Nevertheless, he has remarked that one of the most exciting times in his life was serving as a tutor for the conscious hip hop group known as Boogie Down Productions, and subsequently serving as an executive producer for the Human Education Against Lies project with KRS-One, Lawrence Parker. Professor Poe is a family man that has been happily married for 40 years. He is father, grandfather, and a great grandfather. So we are going to start with Professor Young, and we're going to have him to present right now. Professor Young, you're on.
Okay, greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Asante. I'm honored to be, I was going to say be here.
That's good. It's virtual, but you here, brother.
Yes. So I'm honored to be in this conversation for a number of reasons. One, of course, the work that you've done at Temple University is legendary, right? Serious work, serious programming, serious contribution to not just the richness of the academic experience for our people, but certainly a major contribution to Pan-African thought, Pan-African work. I'm very close friends with a number of individuals who come through that program. And so again, I'm thankful. I'm also happy to be connected with my dear brother. I can't say a whole lot about the experience that he and I shared, Dr. Asante, but I assure you that he's someone whose work I've known for many years. And now I can say that he's my dear brother, and I appreciate him inviting me to this. And I hope I can offer words that fulfill the expectations. I'm also thankful to be sharing the mic, so to speak, with my dear brother, Dr. Poe. I listened very carefully to your introduction, and I'm certainly looking forward to continuing to dialogue with you beyond our conversation this evening. You know, we have to find life on other planets, right?
That's right.
We do our work and we concentrate on where we are, and those places where we are, they concentrate on us, right? So it's easy for us to be distracted and pulled away from one another. And I look forward to connecting and working, hearing more and working with you in any way that the Pan-African cause calls on us. And then finally, I want to say how much I appreciate the fact that Dr. Poe and I, and many others on the call, I'm sure, in this particular political moment, proud to come to a conversation like this being based at an HBCU. You know, we have taken, maybe not us, I may be speaking to the choir here, but it's easy to take the HBCUs for granted. And certainly we did not need, although we love our dear sister, we did not need a vice presidential candidate to affirm the important work of the HBCU. We've been doing it for some time. And the work that we're discussing tonight certainly fits into the framework and the tradition of the HBCU. And none other, no better example is than the important work that Kwame Nkrumah did there. As you perhaps can tell behind me, I'm going to certainly recognize the important work of Du Bois to the Pan-African tradition, but both Nkrumah and Du Bois and their work at the HBCU really exemplify what we're talking about. And I look forward to saying a few words to that regard tonight. Baba Molefe, how much time would you like for me to concentrate on in my remarks? I want to be disciplined. Or, I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I'm sorry, I was muted. You have about 25 minutes.
Okay, that's all I need. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm assuming that I can share my screen. Is that correct? Can I do that?
Yes, you are
Okay.
able to share your screen. If you look down, you should see a green button that says
Indeed.
share screen.
Indeed. Thank you. Bear with me, colleagues. And so, yes, my name is Kurt Young. I am chair and associate professor of the Department of Political Science here at Clark Atlanta University. And as Dr. Asante mentioned in his introductory comments, I've been looking at this Pan-African question for some time. And a funny story, an interesting story is, you know, when I was a graduate student here at Clark Atlanta University, at an age and at a time where I was soaking up as much as I could about the various debates around this Pan-African exercise and tradition. And one of those interesting debates that was just so compelling to me, Baba Molefe, was that discussion that you had with our dear brother Kwame Ture shortly before he transitioned. And it was a discussion where the two of you were reflecting on much of what we're discussing tonight, the philosophical foundations or lack thereof in the Pan-African discourse. And I thought that was such an important dialogue. I struggled with a claim that our dear brother, may he rest in peace, initiated in his conversation, which was this notion that because Pan-Africanism did not have a theoretical or philosophical core, his argument was that scientific socialism would be the most suitable substitute or replacement for that void in Pan-Africanism. And I struggled with that for many years, and it contributed, that struggle contributed to my decision to take on the Pan-African topic in my research work. And by the way, if I can say a few, make a few advisory points to the graduate students that are in attendance here. You know, one of the main sources for the work that we choose to focus our theses and dissertations on are those questions that we find very difficult, those questions that we find frustrating in our pursuit for an answer, right? And so I was among those students, or those students at that time who was trying to figure out this question. I just could not wrap my mind around the thought that Pan-Africanism, this massive movement with a very deep historical roots and a far-reaching global impact, how could something with such a massive impact occur in the absence of a theoretical and a philosophical foundation? I think that would have been circa 1996, 1997, Baba Malefe, somewhere thereabouts in that discussion. And then more recently, here at Clark Atlanta University, we have this weekly departmental seminar. And about a year ago, we were honored to have the great Kenyan thinker and Pan-Africanist, P.L.O. Lumumba, come to join us. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about almost the exact title of this piece, this notion of consolidating theory and practice. And the point that we were discussing was this notion that, contrary to the notion that Pan-Africanism did not have a theoretical or a philosophical core, what was occurring over the many years was that those who found it useful to adopt Pan-Africanism in the advancement of their political projects sought to have their cake and eat it too. By that I mean they were able to, we often had the case where, rather than the lack of a theoretical component, those who saw the benefit of advancing Pan-Africanism politically sought to insert within it the philosophical and theoretical assumptions that they seem to take for granted at a certain time in time in history. That, I argue, is one of the most important challenges facing Pan-Africanism today. And so the topic of our discussion is critical. And I certainly took steps to incorporate it as much as I could into the work that I'm doing. So you will see some of the language that you offered in this discussion in my presentation. So that said, let me move forward. So what is Pan-Africanism? And I'm gonna be careful with my time, and we can spend a whole discussion, Dr. Poe, on this by itself, right? We can stop everything else and just talk about the Pan-Africanist definitions. And so for me, as opposed to notions of Pan-Africanism being defined as a unification of African states, Pan-Africanism being defined by color terms in terms of the coming together of people with Black skin, or in other words, Blackness as a definition of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism defined, among others, as being this sense of musical or artistic expression, right? I argue that part of the struggle that we're having around the theorizing of Pan-Africanism is that we begin from faulty positions in terms of the very definition of the concept. It's a conceptualization problem. And so I address that conceptualization problem by focusing on four parts. One is that African people all over the planet and the communities that we create are parts of a global African family. We are connected in ways that we understand family to be connected. Now, just as family dynamics, that should not mean that we assume that we all hold hands and sing kumbaya at every moment. We have challenges that all families have. But in many ways, the challenges that families have are testament to the belonging to one another. And Pan-Africanism should be defined in that sense. In other words, it is defined by the presence of what Walter Rodney called points of struggle, right? It's global African community. Pan-Africanism is both historical and cultural in terms of its reference to identity. In a certain political moment, we hear quite a bit of consternation around what some refer to as identity politics, right? We're in a certain political moment now where one of the scourges of political discourse is this notion of identity politics, and that it is important for people of African descent, whatever we choose to call ourselves, to shun identity politics. Well, of course, on a very basic level, we need not spend a lot of time here, but on a very basic level, all politics are identity politics. And I think we saw no better example of that than the attempted coup d'etat on January 6th in Washington, D.C. Right? Those individuals were motivated, mobilized in a way that reflected or elevated their sense of identity. And certainly those who were bedfellows with them certainly share that same identity. Those who, and so this notion of identity is something that's ingrained in the American process. In fact, the very notion of defining in-groups and out-groups, the idea that some groups belong to the legitimate American seats of power and others are relegated to be among the outsiders. That line of distinction falls down around identity, whether one identifies with their racial expressions, identifies with their class orientation, because class is real, or whether it is a reflection of culture and cultural identity, it is a prominent power. My question is, how dare we not allow the same kind of reality within the Pan-African discourse? It has to be understood. And of course, central among these various expressions of identity are historical elements of identity and cultural elements of identity. I'll come back to those shortly, but I want to emphasize that as two elements, an additional element of my Pan-African discussion. It is also understood not as simply expressions of notions of oneness. I see my friend, he looks like me, so I'm a Pan-Africanist. Or I see my sister, she walks like me, so I'm assuming that we can come together and be Pan-Africanists in realizing one another, right? Now, I don't mean to neglect that, because one of the realities of our Blackness, and we kind of lose this using Zoom, but I'm going to try my best to capture this. But one of the realities of our Blackness is when we look at one another, we do something like this, right? Just a head nod. That's a unique kind of expression that we have among ourselves. Or when we are in a discussion and we say something like that, and those who have Caribbean roots will understand this perhaps better than others, but a kind of, right? The teeth sucking, right? Where we kind of express ourselves. But that's not a key element of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism assumes a collective struggle for empowerment, right? It is focused upon works towards the empowerment of the first two elements that we saw here. And then finally, and I think this may be the most important point of emphasis for me and the direction of my work after these two projects that I have before me now, which is that Pan-Africanism must be defined as, the goal of Pan-Africanism must be defined as the liberation of African people on the continent and in the diaspora. This is the goal of Pan-Africanism. So we would ask ourselves, unity for what purpose? Not unity for unity's sake, unity to unite the continent? No, unity to identify one another and notice that we belong to one another. Well, that's important, but it doesn't stop there. Unity for the purpose of liberating African people. Now, that's a loaded point because it forces us to reflect on this notion of liberation, but I'll come back to that. Let me move on. So for me, in a theoretical discussion of Dr. Poe, I begin here with Du Bois, and there are many others that we could choose and emphasize here, but I'm going to use Du Bois, and I'm totally looking forward to how you are going to theorize in Nkrumah, and I look forward to that. But let me just use Du Bois here as a sort of way of capturing what I just defined. And he argued here, and this comes from ABC of Color, where he said that to bear the burden, to help bear the burden of Africa does not mean any lessening of the effort of our own problem at home. Rather, it means increased interest. For any ebullition of action and feeling that results in an amelioration of the lot of Africa tends to ameliorate the condition of the colored peoples throughout the world. Right? So within Du Bois's work, he had a mechanism of understanding not only the kind of work that occurs, as he said, at home, to which he dedicated his life and his work, but also to a certain kind of commitment to the African continent and an assumption that our fate is connected. Right? And so let me build from this framework, and indeed I did cite it here, ABC of Color. And I wanted to pay homage to the theme and incorporate the theme by emphasizing this notion of the Pan-African turn. And so what I'm going to contribute here are my efforts to contextualize this notion of this Pan-African turn. It assumes a movement from one direction in a different direction. It assumes a kind of dynamism that's occurring within Pan-Africanism. The moving away from some notion of a stagnant state to something different. And so let me move forward from that perspective. And in doing so, I want to focus on these elements or these contexts within which I would argue around which I would argue Pan-Africanism is turning. I'm going to ask questions about rethinking theoretically the origins of Pan-Africanism. And forgive me, colleagues, I'm going to be fast here because, you know, again, we can spend quite a bit of time on any of these. But theorizing the notions of origins, this duality that Du Bois is talking about, right? I shunned a moment ago this notion of focus on the unification of African continents. I'm sorry, unification of African states on a continent and in the diaspora. But as Du Bois is suggesting, there's at least a kind of duality. This notion of liberation that I emphasized a moment ago, right? How do we contextualize Pan-Africanism from that perspective? And perhaps what I think is most important, creating the space in our theoretical analysis of Pan-Africanism for what our dear brother Maulana Karenga called the culture question, right? And certainly Dr. Asante has done a tremendous amount of work and contributed significantly to our understanding of this culture dynamic. How do we understand it as a key element within our Pan-African aspirations and the work that we have to do to achieve them? So one of the interesting debates that we have, and I think it came to life in that debate that you had, Dr. Asante, back in the 90s with our dear brother, was this notion of how we conceptualize Pan-Africanism and its utility today, its fault lines, its challenges, its contradictions, in many ways rests upon how we define it, how do we define its origins. I'm going to argue that it's a contradiction to begin defining the origins of Pan-Africanism with the Pan-African Congresses of the late 19th century, early 20th century. That's way too late. What we're seeing there is the emergence of an expression of Pan-Africanism that belonged to a very particular moment in time, a moment in time that created a zeitgeist that would shape a unique element of Pan-Africanism or unique expression of Pan-Africanism. But prior to that turn of the century, late 19th century, early 20th century, we have elements of Pan-Africanism reverberating across the planet. And certainly primary among them are these maroon traditions. Right? And so I'm going to begin with this notion that Pan-Africanism, as we theorize Pan-Africanism, an important beginning point is to understand the maroon tradition and the extent to which those elements of the maroon tradition come to play in the way we understand Pan-Africanism and its expressions. And let me pause for a second and say just a bit more about how I understand theory. When we say that we are engaging in a theoretical exercise or theorizing, what we're saying at the very least is that we're identifying a certain set of statements, a certain set of assumptions that we take for granted that defines a certain reality, that expresses within that reality what we assume to be the state of existence, the forces arrayed against that state or in support of that state of existence, what we define as the good life, or in other words, what shall we create in the pursuit of the good life? And then what are the instruments that we use to get there? Question of agency. So when we engage in these theoretical questions and we ask one of the fundamental question, how did we get to where we are? How did this condition exist? The way we understand the origins of Pan-Africanism is key, because therein lies our first step. And when we ask ourselves, what shall we create or what shall we recreate? That question can only be answered based on a sound understanding of our historical trajectory. All right? Now, the critique of what I said would sound something like this: Brother Young, you're staying in history. You're doing your reflection on Pan-Africanism lacks a contemporary relevancy. But show me a successful global movement that does not do that, and I will say that that movement does not exist. You show me the movements of power that exist, even the contemporary movements around what we can call, for example, neoliberalism. All right? That has a very clear historical understanding. They make no apology of grounding elements of neoliberalism in the basic assumptions of Hobbesian thought. Right? No one says leave Hobbes and Locke alone, right? But we should not define ourselves against what others do, but we should be clear in understanding the centrality of our historical understanding of the essence and the emergence of Pan-Africanism. If we fail to do that, we'll continue to be stymied by false starts and missteps. And so I would argue that when we look closely at the Maroon tradition, and this is a picture here of Trelawney Village in Jamaica. I could have chosen a number of, as again, Rodney called points of struggle to identify this, but what is it that they have in common that speaks to a Pan-African reality? The slavers were very careful in their strategy of separating Africans, right? They were very clear that to dominate Africans, they had to figure out ways to keep us from communicating with one another. But what do we find when we study these Maroon traditions? What they were able to erect were communities based upon the need to maintain the survival of African people, but building within those communities those elements of African society, memory, culture that survived the Middle Passage with them. And they recreated a reality that was as close to being African and Pan-African as possible, because as I said a moment ago, the very deliberate effort was to divide Africans. So yes, there were different linguistic elements there. There were very different kind of culture, customs and traditions. But out of that, there's something that transcends those differences that allow them to recreate themselves. My point is that we cannot neglect that going forward. So resistance to slavery itself is a contributing factor. And I'm going to speed up here just because time is short, and I look forward to any discussion in the Q&A. So, but in the 19th century, we have Pan-Africanism again manifesting itself in a different zeitgeist. This is the moment in the 1850s where Martin Delany is making his profound contribution. He is beginning to speak Pan-Africanism in the context of repatriation, Pan-Africanism in the context of emigration, right? This notion of African people moving, leaving one place for the purpose of survival and going to someplace else, whether it's someplace else, whether it's on the continent of Africa, elsewhere in the Americas, as he would write about. But his argument is that there had to be certain steps to be taken, right? And then it's the same moment where Blyden is talking about these notions and these ideas of the ties that bind, right? And in a sense that would connect Africans in the diaspora to the African continent, which would lead many to argue. In fact, let me state it this way. As much as we love our dear brother Du Bois, and as much as we know and love the work of Kwame Nkrumah, two figures who many refer to as, and I don't like these fathers of this and fathers of that, We're looking right here at Sister Anna Julia Cooper, who is too often left out of discourse on Pan-Africanism and the emergence of Pan-Africanism. But what we often do is we talk about Du Bois and Nkrumah and others as the father of Pan-Africanism. Well, I think that if we understand the contributions in the work and the extensive writings of Edward Wilmot Blyden, we will challenge ourselves in that kind of distinction to the extent, again, that this use of fathers of this and fathers of that is even useful. Right? But certainly this period of time also leads to the important work of Anna Julia Cooper, one of the key organizers of the important Pan-African Congresses that are emerging later on in the latter part of the 19th century and then early into the 20th century. Henry Sylvester Williams, our Trinidadian brother, who was again one of those who was responsible for the first Pan-African Conference that took place in 1900. And then Brother Nkrumah. So what I wanted to capture here is contextualizing Pan-Africanism in terms of a kind of a historical flow and continuum rather than discrete moments or discrete separated and events disconnected from one another. That I think is problematic. What we need to do, I would argue, is to understand how one moment flows from a different moment, number one, and perhaps more importantly, how each moment is a reflection of the impact of a certain global reality on what we're calling Pan-Africanism. Again, if we understand it from that perspective, we lose the tendency of struggling or arguing over which moment is Pan-African and which moment is Pan-African and which moment is not, right? It's all a part of a flow, just as we flow, as our dear brother Vincent Hardin uses that very powerful metaphor in his seminal book, There Is a River, where he uses the metaphor of a river that captures the flow of African struggle for resistance, right, from one moment to the next. And what shapes the flow of the river, I'm arguing, among other factors, are the global realities that exist at a certain time, whether it's war, whether it's the Middle Passage, or whether it's something more contemporary now, such as, for example, the recolonization of Africa, right? And so certainly an important moment in this Pan-African trajectory is the Congress movement. And I don't want to go through a history of the Congress movement, but the reason that I cite it as an important step in how we theorize Pan-Africanism is that it allows us to begin to see the contradictions that begin to emerge within the movement that we must learn from and must be a part of our theoretical work. Recall, I'm arguing that one of the key questions that we have to ask ourselves in any theoretical discourse is what are the forces arrayed against that which we consider to be the good life? What is it that we are trying to recreate or create, and what are those forces that are preventing us from creating them? I would argue that when we dig in a very critical way in the Congress movement, we begin to see those contradictions emerge, not in the sense that we are condemning them, but in the sense that they become something for us to learn from as we continue to work, ongoing work of creating a Pan-Africanism that's going to contribute to the transformation of these contradictions that exist among us. Right? So the Congress movement becomes a key element of that. The Fifth Pan-African Congress lays an important foundation, but we know that one of the best ways to understand some of the challenges in our beloved Congress movements is to juxtapose it beside what I'm calling the Garvey foundations, right? And in many ways, when we are confronted by this notion that we should, in addition to our theoretical work, identify the praxis, right? That point where theory and practice comes together. And if we're not able to do that, we're often told that our work is too ideological. But much of what we're discussing here, at least what I'm discussing here, is not brand new. In many ways, it was captured in the elements of the Garvey movement, right? So not only are we theorizing, but we're able to make some theoretical statements about Pan-Africanism, not based on what we think or what we like, but what we created already, right? And so an important exercise in theorizing is this, I would say it's a necessity of having a hard-headed discussion and reflection on what Garvey got right and wrong, and what the Congress movement got right and wrong, and how did they coexist, and what do we take from that, right? In other words, we don't just theorize, again, for the sake of theorizing. We theorize in an attempt to answer those questions that I emphasized at the beginning, right? And so, again, a kind of hard-headed analysis of the Garvey movement will tell us something about Pan-Africanism, but it will also tell us something about how the decline of the Garvey movement contributes to other expressions of Pan-Africanism. How the decline of the Garvey movement feeds into a continuation of Pan-Africanism, as opposed to this notion that, well, the Pan-African movement died with Garvey, or the Pan-Africanism movement died with the creation of the OAU and whatever other type of formation that we think about. My argument here is that our work should include the connecting of dots in a way that tells a story, that paints a picture for us, right? And an important element here in this Garvey movement is the extent to which, when his demise occurs, what happens to that energy? Carlos Cook's and the work of the African nationalist pioneer movement is a critical connection, because in many ways, the transition from Garvey into these latter expressions that I'm going to talk to about in a second flows through the work of Carlos Cook. He's been an almost forgotten figure, and he deserves the work that we have dedicated to other thinkers and figures and actors. And in many ways, to make the connection, understanding Malcolm X as a Pan-Africanist is possible when we understand Malcolm's connection to the Garvey movement. Of course, Malcolm has personal family connections to the Garvey movement, but his connections are also manifest in the context of movement that was occurring in Harlem when he was assigned to Mosque Number 7. And among those who is helping to shape Malcolm's understanding of Pan-Africanism is Carlos Cook's, and the work that Cooks was doing in Harlem at the time, from the 1940s up into the 1950s and late 1950s and the early 1960s. All right, and certainly among Malcolm's connections, I'm sorry, that's a mistake. I'm going to move a little bit quicker through these points. I wanted to emphasize here that you have yet another expression of Pan-Africanism that's emerging, and that's this kind of struggle that's taking place among the Black Bolsheviks and the Afro-Marxists, as I refer to them, and their effort to redefine in many ways what Pan-Africanism is and how we understand its fundamental theoretical elements. Right, here's where we begin to see a shift away from a Pan-Africanism that's centered in many ways the African experience in terms of the African experience, but a focus rather on imported notions of theoretical and philosophical foundations, right? Certainly here in the case of Bolshevism, as it was called around the turn of the century, the early decades of the century, and into the work of the Afro-Marxists, as Ronald Walters refers to them. And certainly among them is the work of Cyril Briggs and the important work that he did with the African Blood Brotherhood, famous for their challenges with the Garveyites in Harlem in the 1920s. But again, this is not just to cite the names. What were they debating? What were they arguing about? What were the points of differentiation that we saw occurring there between them? All right. The same thing could be asked about Robeson. How did Robeson's notions of African unity, African liberation, in terms of his work with the Council on African Affairs, where he partnered with Du Bois in that work in the early part of the century, what was their understanding of African unity and African unification, and how did that differ from expressions that we saw taking place in other parts of the diaspora? Right? These are the kinds of questions that I think we have to ask and we have to drill down to have answers to. It's a very interesting history here with this debate that's occurring. And by the way, Baba Asante, I'm going to argue that your discussion with Kwame Ture is a part of this same debate. It's just a 1990s version of that debate that was occurring throughout that particular part of the 20th century. You see it emerging with the Blood Brotherhood and the intense arguments that they had with the Garvey movement, into the Pan-African Congress movement, Dr. Poe, where we were beginning to see Nkrumah trying to grapple with these kind of class dynamics and at the same time being confronted with the types of contradictions that we saw taking place throughout other parts of the African world that raised questions about these class notions and assumptions that were being taken for granted, right? Nkrumah, I think, takes a swing at it in his important work on conscientism, where he's trying to find that synthesis of trying to reconcile these differences. But within the Congress movement, after his transition, the Congress movement in many ways begins to reflect the difficulty of arriving at that space where we can reconcile these important points. I'd love to come back to this, but I'm going to begin to conclude here. I made reference to Malcolm. I argue that in bringing our historical understanding of Pan-Africanism to a contemporary understanding about how we can theorize Pan-Africanism going forward, I think Malcolm is the key. Malcolm is the key. While there are other elements of Malcolm's story that are more known than others, and other figures who surrounded Malcolm who were equal contributors to the Pan-African struggle, I think that the work that Malcolm was beginning to do with the OAAU becomes an example of the model of the type of Pan-Africanism that I think, if we do our theoretical work, we will end up trying to recreate. This is this notion of a type of Pan-Africanism that exists in a kind of duality, as I mentioned a moment ago. And what is that duality? Let's hear what Malcolm had to say here. In 1965, February 20th, 1965, Malcolm makes a phone call, and he's having a conversation, and I think it's for an interview. And in this conversation, he makes this point. He says, I'm glad I've been the first to establish official ties between Afro-Americans and our blood brothers in Africa. Of course, he wasn't the first, but what he was talking about here was the kind of work that he was beginning to build with the OAAU. Remember, the preparation work in the creation of the OAU stems from his trip to Africa in '64, where he is moving throughout the continent and beginning to not just visit from place to place and give speeches and what have you. His travels throughout Africa is in the purpose of organization building. He's linking up with progressive forces on the ground in these African countries. He's also linking up with the expatriate community throughout West Africa, and he's challenging them to create among their own efforts chapters of the OAAU. He's traveling across into Europe. Yana Cruz's important book, Ghost in Our Blood, talks about his efforts when he goes to make that famous speech at Oxford, the kind of work that he hopes to do on the ground, but he's not able to quite get into it because he's ill. And so this is what he's talking about. He's at that moment where he's trying to make this connection between the work that's taking place on the various parts of the diaspora and connecting it to his own efforts here in the United States. I think we have to spend more time understanding that particular part of Malcolm's story. I'm going to move a bit forward here and go past Rodney, just in the interest of time. I'd love to talk about this if we can have some discussions. I think Walter Rodney is a key figure in where I'm trying to get us to in the discussion. But I want to make this point here. Let me get past this as well. I love these PowerPoints, but they often distract from where your flow of ideas as you try to keep up with the images that you want the audience to see and appreciate. African Liberation Day. African Liberation Day. The boys argue this notion of the work of focus on the African continent does not take away from the work that we must concentrate on the ground, right? African Liberation Day in the 1970s into the early 1980s is an important example of what Du Bois is talking about, and an important outgrowth of what Garvey to Malcolm and others were doing, right? This is what we saw occur. Throughout the African world, Africans are spent every year time focusing on the conditions of Africans on the ground. One of the important contributions of the OAAU, with all of its problems and contradictions, one of its important contributions was its creation of the African Liberation Support Committee. In other words, it dedicated itself to contributing to the ongoing liberation struggles. The OAU was created in 1963 in Addis Ababa, as many of us know. But the reality at that point is that much of the important parts in Southern Africa were still colonized. And the freedom fighters in Southern Africa were entrenched in protracted bloody struggles. And so the OAU, one of its important contributions was its realization that it had to contribute to the ongoing struggle. The emergence of the African Liberation Support Committee out of the African diaspora, where movements, particularly I would say, including many of the ages of many of the young people on this Zoom, were engaged in this attempt to contribute to the ongoing liberation of the African liberation movements in Southern Africa. Our dear brother Fanon Wilkins wrote an important, I think he did his doctoral dissertation on the African Liberation Support Committee, and I think that's been published as a book now. But what is it that we learned from the African Liberation Support Committee and its various expressions? We are familiar with African Liberation Day, right? And this is an image of Maurice Bishop and Samora Machel at African Liberation Day. I want to say this one here was taken in 1970, I forget exactly what year, but it's an example of the work that's occurring under the auspices of the African Liberation Day, African Liberation Support Committee, and ALD celebrations. The idea here is that what ALD represents is the effort among Africans in the diaspora who are focused on the unique struggles on the ground where they exist, and at the same time connecting their struggles to the challenges on the African continent. That is the duality that I think defines Pan-Africanism and must be at the center of our theorizing of Pan-Africanism. How do we understand Pan-Africanism as two efforts coexisting in parallel tracks at the same time? This ability to deal with the realities on the ground, the contradictions on the ground, the negative forces, the harmful forces on the ground, and at the same time connect and link ourselves to what we see occurring on the African continent and other parts of the diaspora. Now, how does this look? How do we understand what this expression looks like?
My brother, I'm sorry, you have about 2 minutes.
I'm just winding up. All right, thank you so much for that. How does it look? It looks like an effort for Africans in one part of the diaspora to communicate understandings of struggle in other parts of the diaspora, to share understandings of the nature of the contradictions that exist on the ground in one part of the diaspora, to, in a sense, inform struggles that occur in other parts, identify the elements that may be successful in places where there were victories, and identifying the reasons for failure or delays where we were not so victorious. What were the organizational steps that were taken to win? What were the tactics that were used in the context of the state to move African people and communities forward? How do we connect these understandings of the unique struggles on one part of the diaspora to inform the struggles of others in other parts of the world? And not in the context of a one-way discussion, but a two-way discussion, where at the same time, one is understanding struggles that occur in other parts of the diaspora. When we raise these questions, I conclude by arguing, we begin to make the most profound theoretical contribution to understanding what we would call this Pan-African turn, this new direction of Pan-Africanism, where we are now not just talking about unification of states, we're not just talking about elements of notions of just unity, right? We're not just building on assumptions of black skin or blackness. No, it is a very practical struggle to build movements around these very concrete issues that confront us in all parts of the diaspora, and do it in a very systematic way. Last thing I would say in ending is there's one thing that I didn't get into towards this end, but the key ingredient that makes all of this possible is this notion of the culture question. I asked the question that Bernard Magubani asked: what are the ties that bind? What is the basis of our Africanness? What is the basis of our connection? And I would argue that central in the answer to that question are those cultural ties that exist across the African diaspora. I'll stop there, everyone. Thank you so much, and I look forward to any dialogue in the Q&A section.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Young, for a very comprehensive discussion and an outstanding presentation. And we will come back with questions if we have times later, but at this time, we're going to turn it over to Dr. D. Zizwe Poe. Dr. Zizwe Poe.
Thank you, Dr. Asante and Dr. Young. Great presentation. I'm going to do a little different. You showed all my pictures, so I'm going to just show a whole bunch of paragraphs and read them. The way that students hate. No, I'm just kidding. But it will be a few paragraphs. But it's an honor to be part of this. My life is this thing. So let me just start and try to, Doc, let me know when I have 5 minutes left, not 2 minutes, because then I can start talking at New York rate. Okay. And if I freeze, just tell me, because I have 2 different devices on. In case I freeze on one, I can go to the other. So here we go. All right. So I'm going to talk about Pan-African praxis and the Pan-African intelligentsia. But before I start, I'm going to tell you a little about my background and also a conversation I had with Dr. Asante in 2000, maybe it was 14, 15 something. We did a Kwame Nkrumah conference, and it was about Pan-African intelligentsia. And so there was a little back room. We had people videoing it and everything. And there was a back room where somebody asked Dr. Asante, what do you thought about the intelligentsia? And Dr. Asante responded based on the elitist notion that most intelligentsias present. He said, I don't believe in because Dr. Asante is about the masses. I know this. He's when I talked to him about Era of the Masses and before, he was like, that's what I like. I like Era of the Masses. And he's really mass oriented. So I'm trying to use this conversation to again raise the concept through Pan-African praxis of the need for a Pan-African intelligentsia, which I think is diametrically opposed to the intelligentsias we're used to, which are usually money-grubbing elites that use their professional skills against the interests of the people and more for just the gain of profit. But we're talking Pan-African praxis, so allow me to get into that. You can see my screen, is that correct? I'm hoping. Yes. Okay, great. Have to check every now and then. Okay, so from here, let me go right into my Dobale. I first want, of course, give thanks to the ancestors that make our existence here possible, and specifically about those ancestors who struggle to strengthen our agency. Secondly, and that brings us into organizers who are people trying to strengthen our agency right now, the organizers of this activity. I've learned a lot actually coming through the Temple program in terms of organizing scholars. Third, I want to give Dobali to all of the people who are here on this event. I promise I'll tell a couple jokes and get through quick so we can get into the questions and debate. Because actually, I really like the presentation that Dr. Young gave because he laid out that history. There's more, but there's no way you can learn all the history of Pan-Africanism in like 25 minutes or an hour. But he really hit on salient points and salient questions, which I want to deal with also later on when we deal with question and answer. But I'm going to rush right through what I have here right now, if I can make it move. Hold on one second. Okay, here we go. So here's the summary of my presentation. Doc Asante and everybody will tell you, I always give my summary first because people run out of time. Or you got to run to the bathroom. You've already been sitting for a half hour. So you'll have my summary in case you miss a piece. Here it is. First part, the essence of life is service to humanity. That's not that complicated. Secondly, organization is the link between our theories and our practice. Organization leads to praxis. And finally, revolutionaries must discover the optimal level of agency for victory. This is true of all revolutionaries. For Afrocentric revolutionaries, we have to discover what optimal levels of agencies give us victory at the time we're facing challenges, and to have a formula for that. And that's what I want to address, really, understanding optimal level of agency and Pan-Africanism dealing with that, in a way of dealing with that. But really, it's not proper that I deal with that. I go there unless I really tell you the book that really got me involved in Pan-Africanism as praxis, and also that got me to come to Temple University to finish my degree. I know there's a bunch of you there right now that are waiting for this. But this is a small book called The Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, which I was introduced to in about 1973, to be quite frank with you. Before I finished school, I went to school originally in CCNY in New York, and I dropped out and then came back a few years later to school at San Jose State. But while I was at CCNY in New York, there was a professor there named Kwame Perezi, who's still alive, matter of fact, who later became an ambassador for Uganda. He turned me on to this book on Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare. But you don't understand how this had an impact on me, and you won't until I tell you this little bit of a story, okay? So I'm of the time, I grew up during the time of, and I grew up in New York City, by the way, the Empire State. They even say it on their license plates. They're not even trying to hire it. The Empire State. I grew up in New York City. And I grew up in a time where I remember my grandparents, my grandmother specifically, going to the March on Washington to hear Martin Luther King give his presentation about insufficient funds. Not I Have a Dream. It was about the U.S. bouncing checks on what they told people they would give them. And I remember that impact it had on my whole community in Queens, New York. I remember when Malcolm X was assassinated. I was a little boy, but it was a major deal in New York now, because that's the temple he was at. And for a while after that, even the Nation of Islam couldn't come to New York, because even though some of the people that read deep into it knew that it was bigger things than the Nation of Islam that killed Malcolm X, the rest of the community that I was in was just disappointed in the disunity within that movement, which we had looked to for some leadership inside of our community. Anyway, so I grew up through that. And at that time, the Vietnam War was going on, just to let you know, to date myself a little bit. And I decided to go to college because I didn't want to go to the Vietnam War, not to get smarter, not to be deeply engrossed in Afrocentric theory or any theory. The only theory I was operating on at that age was avoiding Vietnam, because my friends were coming back from Vietnam as heroin addicts or maimed, people that got blown up in attacks or fighting. They were disturbed. And so I used the college outlet, or tried to use it. And then they finally stopped the draft. I went to college anyway, and I became involved with political activity. The first organization I got into was a Committee for Defense of Political Prisoners. And you know who we were trying to free? Joanna Chesmard. Now, a lot of you may not know who Joanne Chesmard is, but those of you who have history know that Joanne Chesmard was her government name for Assata Shakur. And so that's when I first got involved in any politics. But nevertheless, I wasn't really a great student at the time, because I didn't have this other thing that you guys have that drove me to complete my program. I was just trying to avoid Vietnam. I did that successfully. So then I was just chilling in Finley Lounge at CCNY. And then one day while I was sitting there was this madman that came in the room with a group of other people. They were rearranging the chairs in the lounge, and he brought a podium in and talked about this land belonged to the Native Americans, and he was fighting for Africa. Now, I was mildly inebriated at the time. I'll share that with you. I wasn't that smart, but that shook me out of all inebriation. I said, I do remember the battle between cowboys and Indians, but I thought all the Indians were gone. And that's how I referred to Native Americans, because I was that backwards and my language had that much pejorative sense about it. So anyway, after this person came in and told me that, I really straightened up, and he said, so if you're really down with us and you want to help free your people, come to African Liberation Day. So I'm just following up on you, Dr. Young, and I actually went to African Liberation Day. For me, it was 1974. I went to Malcolm X Park in DC, was what they called it. And there were people from the beginning of the park all the way to the back of the park, all dressed in white. Up in the front, there were speakers from all around the world talking about movements for justice and liberation. And in the back of the park, there was a whole cultural entertainment groups going on. There were people playing on drums, dancers, there was food. It was the greatest thing I had ever seen in my life. And that's when I caught the bug. That's when I caught the bug and decided to integrate myself with this whole movement. As you see a picture of Kwame Ture here. By the way, I also remember the presentation, and it was called the debate between Dr. Asante and Kwame Ture, and it was in Ohio. I remember when it happened, I watched it because at the time I was a member of the organization that Kwame Ture had recruited me to. But after I heard it, it didn't sound like a debate. Matter of fact, what Dr. Asante was doing was actually bringing out some of the information that Nkrumah and Du Bois had actually talked about inside of Ghana in terms of presenting African cultural traditions and norms and innovations to anything that's supposed to be dealing with African revolution. So when I heard them, the two of them, it helped me decide that at some point I wanted to go to Temple. The other thing that helped me decide I wanted to go to Temple is the graduate students at that time. When I came to Temple, I think it was 1995. When I came to Temple, there were activists from all over the place that were there. It was, I was introduced as a scholarist. I felt proud of that because my real entry into real scholarship was through the All African People's Revolutionary Party. In that organization, I learned how to study deeply. As a matter of fact, all of the students that were at San Jose State that were in this organization, the faculty used to beg us to take their classes, even as undergraduates, because we were serious about learning what we needed to learn to be revolutionaries. That's me like 100 years ago, speaking at San Jose State, probably getting ready to introduce Kwame Ture to speak at San Jose State. But I just thought a little nostalgia would be fun because my wife is also watching this presentation. And she was there with me then. Also, this picture somehow just fell into my slideshow. It has nothing to do with what I'm presenting, except I did want to show you that at this presentation that Nkrumah is doing in Harlem, sitting in the audience right here is Malcolm X, and over here is Adam Clayton Powell. To show you this kind of connection that happened, this is before even Ghana is declared as a republic. So this is when Nkrumah comes back. There's a whole history on this. I'm not going to give it to you right now. It's in the book. You want to read it. It's a good book on Kwame Nkrumah's contribution to Pan-Africanism. I want to get into stuff that I think is going to be more important for the students who are here. Now, there was a question that came up, a great debatable question that Dr. Young raised. What is Pan-Africanism? There are some people that only use it as an adjective. We're not. Both Dr. Young and I are talking about Pan-Africanism as a noun, as a pronoun, as a noun of activity. So we're not dealing with it just as an adjective, meaning all Africans, but we're dealing with it as a certain movement that led to certain things. And some people even refer to it as an ideology. To me, it's an objective that different folks approach through different ideologies. But it has these essential elements, and I'm going to tell you where I get these elements from in a minute. Liberation from all parasites, natural and social parasites. That means Pan-Africanism is in favor of regulating the Anopheles mosquito and the tsetse fly, because they don't help the African people. But more importantly, it's also opposed to all parasites of imperialism and those kinds of systems that will take advantage of African people and force African people to give up their agency and their resources. So liberation from all parasites. 2, it's for the development of a Pan-African nation. Now, I know we're going to get in this conversation because what do we mean by nation and nationalism? Actually, folks like Nkrumah and them that were involved in Pan-Africanism in the 60s eventually became anti-African nation states for the interest of a Pan-African nation state. So they began to realize that African independence could only work if there was African interdependence. And there's more on this in a minute. So this is the political piece of it. But in terms of economics, Pan-Africanism wants a people's class economy. Now, a lot of folks that study class struggle through the Marxist analysis or other terms like that don't really understand the concept of a people's class. In order for you to get that concept, I would recommend some reading of the Democratic Party of Guinea's definition of people's class and anti-people's class. It gives a class analysis that allows people to have a Pan-African approach to class struggle, instead of just trying to have a determinist approach of looking at classes merely as the 5 classes that Marx listed, or even the the ignorant kind of class analysis that the United States gives you. You ask your students what class are they, and they all say middle class, so they have no concept of what you mean by class. But the Nkrumah and the Sekou Touré concept of class was that people belong to a class according to what decisions they make and who they agreed to be with. So you could be poor and be part of the enemy's class, or you could be rich and be part of the enemy's class. It's determined by what you decide to do in life. And for those of you who have a hard way to understand this, you can think about Muslims. Uh, people who practice Islam say that humans are born submitting to the will of Allah. So you're born as a Muslim, but in order to stay a Muslim, there are 5 pillars of things you have to do. Christians, you're born being forgiven by God, but in order to stay a Christian, there's things you have to do. What with Pan-Africanism, or even to be an African, it's the same. You can be from Africa in terms of being an African descendant, but you can abandon your place that you descend from or the people you descend from and decide to serve some other nation and therefore have a different identity. I think it is important for us to understand identity physics. And I think Dr. Young and I will get into that a little bit during the question and answer piece. Then finally, because it is a global outlook, Pan-African personality on world affairs, the new understanding of Pan-Africanism has to understand Pan-African personality on world affairs. Now, my concept of Pan-Africanism I just presented you here does come from a concept that I learned, which is this concept. Hold on, sorry, that's the people. I just want to show you some picture of them. But this concept, the total liberation, this is what we used to say in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Pan-Africanism is the total liberation and unification of Africa and Africans under scientific socialism. That's what we said. And I think Dr. Young is right that some of that was conditioned by the forces at that time that were involved in the African Revolution. So we use the term socialist and what have you, but Dr. Young is also correct where he says that Kwame Nkrumah really was looking at basing things based on African value systems, and that even though he was working with the Soviet Union at one time and China at another time and other people in the socialist realm of things, Kwame Nkrumah still thought that what was at the root of things is an African communal value system. But he said that those value systems don't protect you from other evolutions of social systems that came after communalism. So a new system was necessary that could serve the population, the African population, and the breadth of the African population. So my students look at this sometimes and they say, well, yeah, but I live in the United States. And what I have to share with them sometimes is that, well, if this is a fact, we know about this. If a Japanese part of a Japanese population is attacked in the United States, Japan will make noise. Even though they got a bomb dropped on them before, they still have a country that can make noise. And don't get me started on Israel and its and the folks that they say they're protecting. Okay, but you just say something and automatically they
All right, hello, Jasmine.
Yes, I think Dr. Poe like freezed for a little bit, but he is also logged in on another device, so he should be coming back.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, I think the FBI was watching our presentation. And this happens. Okay, so let me move on. Finally, besides the continental-wide socialization, also mass political and economic control. We have the technology today to make that to happen. I'm going to move on and try not to get disconnected again. So let me move on real quick here. Okay. Those of you who are students at Temple, let me give a little bit of background even before I go into these 5 essential elements of Afrocentricity. Okay, so I worked in the University of California for 10 years after I graduated, and I was organizing for the All African People's Revolutionary Party in California. As a matter of fact, I became the chair of the political education committee there. That's where I first got involved with research, studying, and teaching. Okay. But as I was ready to leave, and because also my voice was being cut short in administration in University of California, I was looking for another place to go and finish my terminal degree. And then I saw the most progressive catalog in the country for what I was interested in. It was at Temple University, of course. And from there, I went to Temple University and it was a buzz of activity. Like I said, all these activists, Black Panthers around, RAM, people from RAM, different organizations, people from different parts of the world were there, all learning about the concept of Afrocentricity. I could take classes that talked about Padmore, that talked about Nkrumah, that talked about Du Bois, all at Lincoln in a graduate program. Now, I know for some of you, you may take this for granted, but for me, all I had experienced were maldeveloped academicians. I worked in the administration, but as I saw the Eurocentric curriculum work on the African people, I noticed that the curriculum of the academy was turning these people against their population, making them foreigners even when they returned to their community. So that was problematic for me. But when I saw what was going on at Temple, I was like, yo, this is a liberated zone. For a minute, I could hang out here. Now, don't get it twisted. The enemy attacked us even at Temple, and they'll attack you everywhere because that's their job. They're supposed to attack. At the same time, we're supposed to begin to build and become clear enough to figure out how to beat them even though they attack us. So anyway, the essential elements of Afrocentricity, of course, psychological location as determined by symbols, motifs, rituals, and signs. Dr. Sante, of course, taught us this. Taught us that the commitment to find the subject place of Africans in any of these environments were important with social justice implications. A defense of the African cultural elements as historically valid, celebration of centeredness, and imperative to revise the collective text. This brought to me in my understanding of Nkrumahism from the AAPRP, using these kinds of pillars of understanding, helped me to work with developing a Pan-African centered paradigm, where not only did we look at individual agency, but also we began to focus on organizational agency. Dr. Young talked about how do we unite? And I think one of the things that's important for unity, for Pan-Africanism to work, is for people who understand Afrocentric direction in terms of academic approach, to understand that it's important to understand different levels of agency. Sometimes a local agency, people operating in a local level of agency will feel that a larger agency or a national agency or federal agency is contradictory to what they're trying to do. Here's the truth. Some situations have to be solved with individual agency, that is, with individual will. You have to make some decisions on your own. Some decisions have to be decided with organizational agency. Organizational agency means that you're working with a planned group of collective that you guys agree on what's going to be accomplished. But without these senses of agency, then you just become battered by the forces that work on you. So the Pan-African centered paradigm looks at individual agency and organizational agency in the intellectual space and social landscape, continues to utilize location theory and applies it even to sociological, psychological, aesthetical, political, and philosophical concepts that may come from other areas of the academy. And historicity and hermeneutics is very important. Just having the facts is never enough. It's the questions that drive the facts you're looking for and the narrative of it that's so important. So not only do we critique, we also de-link, and we denounce Eurocentric hegemony, Sinocentric hegemony in any shared academic space. But in a way, I don't have a problem with Eurocentric thought and Sinocentric thought. I have a problem when that hegemony tries to universalize itself on me. I think Europeans need to be centered in their European thing. And the Chinese need to be centered in their Sinocentric thing, just like we need to be centered. But to impose their perspective on me as a universal thing, well, Afrocentricity takes care of that. We don't accept that. Finally, the assertion of an African culture, personality, community, and genius. I remember being with Dr. Sante when he was arguing with Mary Lefkowitz. He allowed me to attend the debate that they were having. And those folks like Lefkowitz and other people that were there around that time said that there was no way there could be anything such as a composite African. They couldn't understand Dr. Sante's assertion of a composite African. But his assertion of a composite African also helped me deal with the assertion of African identity as a composite African identity, African culture, African personality, African community, and African genius. Yes, there are specific differences in the local area, but generally there's also this collective sense of these things. Okay, so I was going to spend time breaking down the whole thing of agency. I love doing this. You know, what agent comes from, the whole word, the etymology of where agency comes from. But let me just go to the summary. Agency is willful activity, okay? And like Dr. Sante taught in his classes, and I teach in mine, is that the first thing that happened with slavery is the removal of your willful activity. And I tell my students when they tell me they're coming to college because they want to get a job, I said, when you came to the United States, you had a job. Matter of fact, you had tenure and you couldn't get out. Anyway, agency is a psychosociological concept of the psychosociological concept of agency only looks at the individual as the point of origin of agency, but Afrocentricity does not. From the point of individual, psychology and sociology seek to ontologize and serialize agency. In other words, what came first? There's a growing doubt around this description power of this concept, this individual agency that psychologists and sociologists try to use. So I went to Afrocentrists to look at agency as I was dealing with the concept. And some psychosociologists see individual agency as an experience and not generative. And you can find that if you look in the text called The Illusion of Conscious Will by Wegner. However, let me shrink this just a little bit. The psychosociological identification of self constructs a competitive relationship between the individual and collective self. And this is where it comes from a text called Agency and Alienation, A Theory of Human Presence by Segal. This dichotomy contradicts the continuous cultural flow from the collective to the individual, which is assumed and understood in the Afrocentric paradigm. Okay, I'm speeding up really quickly here because I don't know how much time I have or when I'll get cut off again. This concept, this collective agency concept, has greater breadth and depth than the concept of individual agency. The power to affect reality in future generations is greater in the collective arena than the individual arena. Generative agency flows from the collective. And this is what I think the students today have to understand that come through Afrocentricity, come through the school, the Temple School of Africology. Collective agency enhances common sense. It was mentioned in my background. I worked with Boogie Down Productions and KRS-One. Knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone is his name. I worked with him in a few years back, and this is before I came to Temple to get my PhD. But while we were going out giving out lectures, we were telling people that they had to be aware of the curriculum, the Eurocentric curriculum that the schools give them, because it was erasing their common sense. As a matter of fact, we coined a term called Common Sense Deficiency Syndrome, CSDS, which we said will definitely lead to AIDS. And we were explaining it. Folks had a laugh, but they also understood that there was something more than the 5 senses a person have, that there was this thing called common sense. And we told them that common sense is just the beginning, because higher than common sense is collective consciousness. And the highest point is collective self-consciousness. That means not only do you understand the collective, but you also understand your role in serving the collective. So assumed in this concept is the sense that what is best for the collective is best for the individual. Now, I think I have this done in a pictorial way, so I don't eat up all my time. I don't really need all the rest of this. I want to show you these pictorial presentation.
You have 5 minutes, brother.
That's good. That's all I need. Wait till I get to these pictures. You see. Okay. Here it is. Matter of fact, if you get a chance, if you can take a snapshot, take snapshot of these pictures that are coming. Very informative. So agency is first and foremost the self-conscious active character of the people in its multidimensional growth and development. Okay. The people. At the center of the people, by the way, are the macro identity of our species. This helps you deal with people class. At the center of this goes back ancient times, of course, is the Ankh, life. Life is the center of the people. This is what we worship before we worship anything else. And as we came to understand time and space, that helped us to organize ideology and biology, to become aware of ideology and biology. Life is still at the center of all of this. And connected to this is science and aesthetics. We understand that it's a science, and we don't break up STEM and say that that's something different than what the humanities are. In the Afrocentric perspective of the life of the people, those things are connected. They're cultural generators. The organization and the material production leads to the people. This describes the character of the people. And as a result, as it describes the character of the people, it also describes human culture. Okay. And those were some of the main points I wanted to show you. Then to give you a couple of shots out on the population. I've already told you what my summary is. I just want to show you some pictures of the people instead of just looking at individuals all the time, and remind you of the obstacles, the parasites, the mosquito, the tsetse fly, and the great hidden white hand. Okay, that's more drawn up here. Lastly, to leave you with this ideological synthesis, and this is not the same, by the way, as some people say, as what's his name, Missouri. Ah, somebody will remind me of his name. But what Nkrumah said that was necessary for our African cultural dynamic is that we always have to begin with the traditional African base. The Islamic influence and the Euro-Christian influence are influences, but what we grow on is our base. And in terms of the concept of culture, I just want to remind people that culture is a dynamic thing, all right? It has traditions, and we should be keepers of tradition. At the same time, we have to remember that every tradition started off as an innovation. So we have to figure out how to bring in innovations. So if they're workable innovations, they may become some of the new traditions and may replace some of the older traditions that no longer serve us. I think I just want to say this, another piece added to my summary, which is coming up right here. Some books explaining zones. No, I don't need that right now. But besides the addition to this summary is what was read in my introduction. I'm really looking for some junior faculty that want to become scholarists and use their scholarship as tools to make knowledge really very powerful for the students that come through them. And lastly, to become scholarists by recognizing that that the organization of their scholarship should be able to serve our people as we struggle to include a stronger sense of Pan-Africanism, as we struggle to build a real African nation that protects African people around the planet. For instance, even as folks come to offer us support, other people outside of Africa come to offer African communities support, we need to have a Pan-African intelligentsia that can evaluate the support they're offering to see if that support actually helps us move closer to having our own agency or if it actually steals the agency from us. And a practical way to look at this is to see how this COVID is being dealt with, how African communities are being dealt with this COVID reality. Does it really help us, or are there more tricks coming? Okay, so I'll stop there, and I thank you for your time and attention, and I'm ready for some conversation, and I'm also ready for you to send me your Vitas for when you guys want to begin teaching Pan-Africanism, African Revolution, and I even need some people to come to Lincoln and be adjunct professors to teach Afrocentric classes. But that's a whole nother conversation. So thank you for your time. I'll unshare the screen so that we can let our directors direct the conversation.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for, again, another powerful presentation. One of the things that we know, because we are experienced and because we know that there are some outstanding intellectuals in this country whose voices sometimes are not heard as much as they should be. These two scholars have definitely shown us what scholarship for liberation is. And I really want to thank them. I appreciate them. And I count them as friends and colleagues. And this has just been marvelous. I want to just make a pause here and say that we wanted to dedicate this presentation to the great James Nazir Conyers, who passed away a couple of days ago, who was the editor of more than 40 books and was a giant at the University of Houston. And he helped so many people. And unfortunately, his heart gave out on him, but he was one of our great present people, and also I must say attended Temple University as well for his PhD. So at this time, I'm going to ask Jasmine, want to do a shout out to someone that I just happened to notice. There we have a couple of people, Dr. Harvell, who also went to Temple. I saw her here for the first time in 20 years to see her, and Dr. Jima Oligari, whose father, Brimi Oligari, brought me into a Pan-African organization many years ago, the African World Organization, which he headed. And I just ran across a paper that I had planned to send, some information I planned to send to Dr. Ola Garrett. I happened to see her on this list. So I hope to get that to her. Her father was a major activist out of Nigeria, in this country and in Africa, for a Pan-African world, bridging the African world. So that's all wonderful. But at this time, Jasmine, do we have any questions?
Yes, we actually have one question right now, and it's how can we reach our speakers? So if someone wanted to get in contact with them, what would be the best way?
Okay, okay. Well, that's a good question. Do you brothers want to give your information, or what do you want to do? How do you want to do that? You want to put it in a text, or you want to just say it? You can state it.
I'm going to put it in the text, and please reach out. I'll put all my contacts there.
All right, beautiful. All right, that's wonderful.
And I'll say mine because it's short enough. And I know sometimes people just don't get the text before the Zoom closes.
That's right.
But I'll put it in the chat also. But it's D as in done, POE, DPOE at lincoln.edu.
Very good.
Lincoln is LINCOLN. Just
they may think it's Lincoln or something.
Yeah,
right?
something. Yeah,
Lincoln. Right. But if you know HBCUs, you know Lincoln. I mean, that's for sure. So okay. So are there any? You know, I could certainly be a part of this presentation and give a whole lecture, but I never like moderators who take over the program. So I'm going to resist the urge and just suggest that if you're interested, my book is called An Afrocentric Pan-Africanist Vision. An Afrocentric Pan-Africanist Vision. And it is very, I mean, I think I deal with a very interesting thesis. And I would certainly refer people to it and hope that you would take a look at it. And
it's an excellent book.
And well, thank you very much. I mean, it does take on some challenges, and I always say, I'm just trying to see here. It's there are about 15 chapters in it, and it is an attempt to clarify some things that I ran into, because we all run into different aspects of this question. It's a very powerful subject to talk about Pan-Africanism. And for me, we have sometimes underplayed the impact of George Padmore on the socialist power of the movement. And George Padmore came to this country from Trinidad in his early 20s and joined the Communist Party. He came to go to Howard, and almost as soon as he got here, the communists got him, and he joined the Communist Party. And a year later, they took him to Moscow.
They sent him a one-way ticket.
Their one-way ticket to go to Moscow. And he became a major propagandist for Lenin and those guys. And so ultimately, I believe that by 1945, he was, of course, a major figure in the Marxist world and the tradition. And I think he had a lot of influence on the fifth Pan-African Congress that we still are trying to decipher, so that many of the revolutionary movements, the anti-empire movements of the African continent, actually, all of them actually were socialist movements. And I think that was, to a large degree, the influence of Padmore. But at any rate, that's another discussion, and we can get into that at other times. But I just want to give another shout out to Dr. Kurt Young, Brother Biton in our fraternity, and Dr. Poe, outstanding Afrocentrist, for your presentations tonight. You have made us very, very proud, very happy, and we'll see the rest of you hopefully.
Wait, Dr. Asante, I'm
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
sorry to interrupt. We
No,
actually
please.
just got 2 questions in the
Okay.
chat.
All right.
The first one is for Dr. Poe. It says, what does Dr. Poe have to say about the attempts to strip Nkrumah and his ideas from all institutions in Ghana?
What do I have to say about that?
Yeah.
Okay, so so this is what I think. These struggles go on, and some of this is revisionist history, which people do. And I know that the current government in Ghana, first of all, I don't think that they can really strip everything. There's a lot of things with Nkrumah on it in Ghana. What they're trying to do is the revisionist history of it is they're trying to include what they call the Big Six as the founders of Ghana as an independent country. Now, let me say this to everybody listening. Nkrumah was a good president of Ghana, but he was a much better Pan-Africanist for Africa. When Ghana became independent, he told all the people that were there in the Polo Grounds listening to him that Ghana's independence was meaningless unless it was linked up with the total liberation of the entire African continent. And everybody was like, yeah, they were shouting and everything like that. But nobody said, huh, what'd he say? You mean he's going to use our budget to free the rest of Africa? Which is what Nkrumah said about doing. And also some of the political systems that they put together there, for instance, the one-party state of Ghana, and the creations that Nkrumah was trying to build on top of that triangle I showed you, African traditions, but these other influences. The negotiating for that caused Nkrumah some problems inside of Ghana. But today, the attempt to remove, actually, I was in Ghana. I spent about 2 months in Ghana in the past 2 years, and I don't see them trying to remove Nkrumah. They're trying to make the opposition to Nkrumah, they're trying to say it's equal to what Nkrumah brought
Right.
to Ghana. Because there is a whole institute named after Nkrumah at the University of Ghana. There's the Kwame Nkrumah Institute of Technology. There's a number of things that build Nkrumah into, and the majority of Ghanaians are proud of Nkrumah, not because he was just a founding father, but he in fact brought a strong reputation to all of Ghana for Africans from throughout the world. They just made a whole bunch of money on Africans from the U.S. just the past year, the year returned. So yeah, so they're not trying to give up that money to try to say that they was great. So anyways, bottom line is that Nkrumah is still strong, not only in Ghana, but if you like, for instance, visit the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, until this year, there was only one statue there, and it was the statue of Kwame Nkrumah. Even though he wasn't really in favor of what they built, but they know that even the compromise they made with him is why they have the African Union. Now there is also their statue there now also of Haile Selassie.
All right, Dr. Young, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, it's okay. I'll
No.
wait for the next question, just in the interest of time.
Okay, Jasmine.
Yes, we have another question that says, can anyone comment on volumes 1 and 2 of the meta-nature?
Well, I think that's for another discussion. I mean, I think unless anybody wants to make a comment on it. Okay, Dr. Poe. Dr. Poe, go right ahead.
Yeah, I have one comment about the centrality of historical consciousness in terms of Kemet, both with Nkrumah and Garvey. Garvey had a shrine. Some people don't read deep enough about Garvey, but Garvey had a shrine to Kemet. I don't know if you know that. In his house, he had a shrine to Kemet. And Amy Jacques Garvey speaks about this in Garvey and Garveyism. And also in Nkrumah, after there was the first Conference of Independent African States, about 8 states came to Ghana to start off the first time the African heads of states met together. Nkrumah went to visit these states, and the travel was organized by Padmore and about 100 sisters from Ghana, because they were part of the government that were going. And Nkrumah spent the majority of his time as he traveled to visit all the states that came to Ghana in Egypt, so that he could go and visit the artifacts of ancient Egypt. So this kind of historical consciousness of the Africanity of Egypt is embedded in the Pan-African movement. I just
Mhm.
wanted to say that.
Very, very, very good. So thank you both very, very much. And the person who wants to have a conversation about Medu Neter, you certainly can write to me and or call me at Temple, or leave a message, and I'll be very happy to have a conversation with you about the work of Brother Ra. Amen. All right, take care and see y'all. And
Doc,
thanks, Jasmine,
that,
and
No,
thanks
Doc,
to
Dr. Sadi, Dr. Young wants to say something.
Dr. Young. Go
yeah,
right ahead.
yes. Really briefly, I'm just getting a chance since I finished my words to just look around at the members of the audience, so to speak. And I just want to acknowledge that we have two graduate students who joined us tonight from the Clark Atlanta University
Oh,
Department of
beautiful.
Political Science. And I want to say thank you to them. But also, as I was perusing the audience, I noticed Professor Dove. You know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dr. Dove,
Yeah.
back in the 80s, back in the 90s, one of the paths of my research was to understand this African-centered critique of the various lines, but certainly the African-centered critique of the Marxist line. And so I spent a lot of time grounding myself in Barbara Carruthers' work on intellectual warfare, which he may have published a little bit later, but that was a collection of essays that he had written over the year. And your important piece on the critique of Afrocentric or African-centered critique of Marxist thought. Forgive me for butchering the title, but I just want to say how much I appreciate that piece. It was an important piece for me at an important time, and I thank you. It's wonderful to see you here tonight.
I really appreciate that personally because we just hired her on our faculty. She's one of our secret weapons, and so she is absolutely a
I don't know how
powerhouse.
secret. I don't know how secret that is.
Yeah, she's a powerhouse sister. And in fact, her new book is coming out hopefully in the next month. So we're just really delighted to have her. Thank you so much for that comment, Dr. Young. Uh,
Indeed.
all right. And thank you, Dr. Poe, all of you, everybody, fantastic. And we have another program on the Washington Capitol insurrection, which
Wow.
will be coming up we're talking about racial implications of that coming up February the 6th. It would be moderated by Dr. Aaron Smith, but we have Michael Cord and the attorney, the angriest black man in America, and lots of really outstanding people. Thank you very much, and all y'all have a wonderful, strong, victorious evening. Peace.
You, Doc. I want to collect the chat. Okay. Won't happen.